Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at this amazing bush plane slash short takeoff slash just a classic plane, the DHC-2 Beaver. Now this is a really neat airplane that they just added over in the most recent expansion pack here, and it's a really impressive plane, and they did a real nice job on it. So let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, we climb on board this thing. Depending on what options you've selected, you might notice it's a little, oh, hi there. It's a little difficult to kind of see out here doing this thing. So if you float your way over to this tablet, you're probably going to notice there's a bunch of different options here. One thing we can do, of course, is we can remove all this nastiness that's kind of holding us down, so to speak. You also have the ability, of course, to cut, be a person if you want to remove the co-pilot so you can see a little bit better. You can also shut off the vibration. You can also adjust the avionics inboard, which I think is actually really cool. If you want to switch, for example, to analog radios, you can hit that, or you can leave the GPS in position, assuming you even had something like this to begin with. So that's all looking pretty good. That's all pretty good. When you're done, you can just close it and not have to stress about it too much. Now, one of the challenges for this aircraft was trying to find a decent checklist for it that sort of agreed with what we saw in Flight Sim, plus what we could find in the real world. And I actually tracked one down, and I put it down in the links below for those of you who like to take a look at that and kind of follow along. So what are we all about here? We're all about getting this thing started and kind of figuring where all the key buttons are. One thing that I thought was really surprising about this and going through the POH was the fact this aircraft is actually fairly limited as far as its tolerance for things like crosswinds. And a lot of that is because we are a conventional landing gear technique. If you actually look here in the back real carefully, we got this little tiny wheel sort of chilling there. We got to be really careful with that when we do our landing. So let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and hide the yoke because it's just going to get in the way and make things a little more difficult for us. Now keep in mind, our POH here is going to have different buttons than we're going to see in this version. This is definitely a customized version of this one. But we basically have all of our engineering controls, our engine controls, should I say, all located here. We've got our avionics switch on this side. We have all our critical lights. We have all the other options here. Our beacons right there. We also have the boost coil, which isn't even an option in this particular aircraft, plus the starter, plus the fuel boost. On the older versions of the Beaver, you actually had the ability to hand crank start it, and you also had what they call an inertial starter, which unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on who you ask, we don't have to deal with that. The other thing you're going to see in this little panel here is you're going to see the option to go ahead and pop on our fuel selector to what we want to do. Now, the interesting thing is the book suggests starting on the center tank, then switching to the rear tank if there's any fuel in it. The idea here is to make the center of gravity shift forward as the weight of the aircraft decreases during your flight. It's just, I consider, a little bit safer. One thing I'm always tipped about is you have this little front tank too. If you suck all the fuel out of that first, you're going to run into a situation where your center of gravity is going to shift backwards during flight. So it's, again, one more thing you have to kind of stress out about during your flight, but not too much. Speaking of fuel, let's go ahead and get some gas. Pop up rear. You can see I'm taking a full load, front, center, rear. If we were flying all by our lonesome here, we could probably skip some of these, but like I said, our center of gravity is well within reason here. I'm not going to stress about it. So let's go ahead and do it. So we pop in the plane. First things first, we want to make sure our ignition is set off, which it is. We're going to set our parking brake, which I'm going to just pull this little handle out right here. Parking brake set. We're going to take the controls and we're going to make sure they are unlocked. We confirmed that a little earlier. Everything's feeling pretty good as far as that goes. Free and control controls. We're going to adjust the pilot seat. We're going to set the trims as required. I'm not going to worry about the trims too much. In the real world, of course, when you're playing the trim game, you want to make sure that it's set correctly. Their idea of correct is right. I just find that funny. Next, what we want to do is we want to make sure all our switches are off except for the generator, which I think is kind of a neat little touch here. Our generator is going to be our alternator here, so we're going to flip that one on. We're going to go ahead and tap the battery master switch on. What that will do is that'll make some of our gauges sort of wake up here. We're just going to confirm that the fuel that we see right now is the fuel that actually makes sense. Now, one thing I'm really tickled by, and this just gives you an idea of just how traditional this aircraft is you're going to notice a tail down. When we are sitting here on the ground, the fuel meter is going to read differently than when we are in the air. So if you actually see where this is 24 right here, right now, if we're carrying 24 gallons in there, let me go and open this one up real quickly here. We got about 25 gallons in the rear tank. Where's my rear tank here? So we have our rear tank. You'll be pointing to that particular line on account of the fact that it would be like this. So if we actually go ahead, let's test that theory real fast here. Check this out. So we'll set ourselves to 24 gallons of fuel here in that particular tank. Now notice this needle should not be pointing right here. This needle should be pointing right here because of the fact that our tail is on the ground and all the gas sloshes backwards. So it's just one of those little details that they got pretty close, but at the end of the day, it's like, oh, come on, one more, that would have been so cool. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to set our altimeters and make sure all the instruments are okay. Clock is set. I've set my altimeter. It looks pretty good here. Communications equipment. This would be a great time to test it. Of course, we could pop the radio on. Red 6-4 radio check. All right, sounds good. Sounds good. And of course, we don't need that at this time when we're doing starting. Good time, of course, to test all your lights. In the real world, what we would do is we'd run around the outside of the aircraft and make sure all the different lights that we need are working. In this case, I'm turning my bacon and my strobe, and if I run around outside, those lights should be engaged, which we can see the little green light, so that works perfectly fine. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and check our panel lights, interior lights. This is a really important concept for us because if something goes wrong, we want to make sure this is working before we take off, especially if we know we're going to be flying at nighttime or something like that. So now we get to the fun part, and I really get a kick out of this, and that's the fact that we have to go get a fire guard to stand basically right here with the fire extinguisher, just in case the thing decides to catch fire on us. So we're, of course, going to go ahead and call it clear, depending on which version of the aircraft. Of course, we can open the door and yell, "Clear, prop!" And everybody goes, "Oh, God," and ducks for cover as soon as you do that. Okay, it depends on kind of what you're doing here. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to shut all switches off, is what it says. Obviously, we're going to leave our bacon light on here just to be kind of nice to everybody around us. We're going to leave that one all set. We're going to take our throttle lever, and we're going to crank it 1/4 of an inch in. Now, I'm going to go crack it about that far. By the way, 1/4 inch, it's real world 1/4 inch, so it's about that far. It's not that much. This is a weird one, but in this aircraft, you actually take the propeller handle and leave it all the way back during start. And then our mixture lever is actually also going to be all the way back, which is a little weird. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go down here to the carburetor heat level, and you can see we have a couple different options. Let me go flip it down here so you can see it. So right now my carburetor heat is cranked to hot. We're actually, that's the wobble pump, my bad. So we're going to go make sure this is set to the cold position, which is what we have it right here. So now what we do normally is we yell to the ground crew and say, "Hey, could you guys go ahead and turn the propeller a couple times around so that we can go ahead and make sure that nothing's all stuck and jammed up." We're not going to worry about that though. So now that that's all been done and the propeller's been rotated a couple times by hand, now we can go ahead and get this sucker started. Battery is on, propeller area is clear, fuel and oil emergency cutoff lever are set to the open position. So we have this little emergency lever here. You just want to make sure that is in the down position, which means we're getting some fuel here. Fuel selected to the fullest tank. All of our tanks are full, so I'm going to go ahead and start it on the center tank today, which is going to be fine. We're going to go ahead and put auto rich for the mixture. This normally would be an automatic mixture control. This one is a manual. This must be like an aftermarket kind of option, but that's perfectly fine. Throttle level is open, and now we have to build up fuel pressure. This is an interesting little thing here because normally what you would do is if you take a look at my little fuel pressure gauge here, right here, you can see that I have no fuel pressure whatsoever. So what you have is you have this thing called a wobble pump, which you can hand crank to build up fuel pressure. Come on. Okay. So you can see we've actually built up some fuel pressure. And you'll also notice if I don't touch it, that fuel pressure quickly wears off. And now the aircraft is actually going to get to the position where it can no longer actually engage itself here. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, wouldn't this be the part when you go ahead and click on the boost pumps? Yeah, it's going to depend on like the manual. Like I said, the POH versus this one's going to be slightly different. We are going to turn on the boost pump. And if you turn that on, you'll actually notice that will give you fuel pressure right away, which if you want to start it traditionally, we've got the wobble. If you want to start it kind of modern way, you can come over here and hit that one. So again, it's kind of interesting how those two work there. So now we're going to take the ignition switch. We're going to go pop it into the both position. We're just going to click, 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 which means we're now ready to connect that one. And now what we do is we just start. Now, the weird part with starting this particular one is when it catches, you have to be quick to reduce the RPM to make sure that you don't do any damage to anything after it starts. But the starting process on this one is relatively straightforward. So we're going to come over to the little starter switch right here. It's this guy. Everything else is good to go. Go ahead and press and hold. And once it catches, you're just going to play with the RPM, and you're going to get it. Actually, it's almost perfect. I'm actually kind of happy about that. And we're going to leave it right there. Like I said, you could use the wobble pump to fire it, or you could also kind of do it conventionally. Just kind of keep an eye on it. After you start it, it tends to get a little kind of wibbly wobbly. By the way, if you look really carefully, do you notice how this handle is going like all over the place? You can actually come over here with this tightness, and you can crank up the tension on these like really, 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 really high, and that will start them from doing that little happy dance that you just saw them doing a few moments ago. So the engine is fired. The thing is started. Everything's looking pretty good to go. We're not starting by hand crank. So now we're ready to go ahead and get the warm-up procedure. Warm-up process is relatively straightforward. We're going to go ahead and give it about 1,000 RPM. Now, I know what you're thinking, but don't worry. We're going to fix that in a second. Give it just a little tiny bit. That's going to make the oil pressure light go off. Yep, exactly what I expected. And now we're going to go ahead and take the RPM lever. I'm just going to go ahead and pop that forward. And now what that should do is give us the ability to get to about 1,000 RPM. There we go. Perfect. So in the real world, of course, I can say this very confidently. This needle would never be that steady. It just doesn't do it. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that's in all the way in, and you can see the oil pressure once it gets up to a nice happy amount. Float down here, you can see our oil pressure. It's fine, so I'm not worried about that at all. We can use our propeller. Well, the temperature is way, way too cold to really do anything useful for it. And basically, we're sitting here kind of waiting for it to kind of relax. One thing that you do in the old days is you could select the propeller lever and pop it to a really, really coarse RPM. You could go do one of these kind of things like that. And basically, what you're trying to do at that point is just to get the oil to be kind of moving around this propeller for the constant speeder in order to make it work. Of course, course, when you do stuff like that, you have to make sure you kind of bring it back. So it's just another way to kind of get that oil circulating around the engine, which, like I said, pretty wild. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a quick little ground run up here. Obviously, we're not really that warm. After start checklist, we can go ahead and turn that guy on. We can make sure anything else down here is on. Everything else down there is fine. I'm not going to stress about that too much. We're going to get all sorts of warning lights and things like that, which is pretty much what I expect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get ourselves over to a position where we can go ahead and do a little run up here. I'm looking at the wind right now, and the wind seems to be favoring. I'm just looking at it real quickly. Seems to, that's really difficult to identify. The wind seems to be coming out of that direction. So we basically got to do a 180. So what I will do is I'll kind of go head over the runway now. All right, going to go ahead and release my parking brake. This one is a little different. It is a conventional landing gear. So when you hit this, make sure any braking operations you do, you're going to go ahead and tug backwards, because you really see how it almost did a little face plant when I did that pull back there. You want to be very, 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 very gentle here. And again, you can just gently hold the brakes. The nice thing about flight sim versus the real world is brakes are free. So if you want to ride the brakes a little bit because you don't want to get going too fast, that is perfectly acceptable. They did a really nice job on this. Come down here, go ahead and press the enter key, go ahead and press the enter key. Look at how nice of a job they did. Well done, guys. Sweet. All right, just kind of easy on the brakes there. Now we're at a tailwind, and tailwinds and tail draggers never go together. And go just a little bit of breakage. I don't want to do anything too sketchy here. There's plenty of runway there for me to take off. I just need to set myself up in a spot where I can do a quick little run up. All right. Look at how neat this plane is. This thing is just so wild. Oh, wow, there's somebody in the middle of... I'm literally in, like, southern Chile here. I'm really impressed there's somebody else out this way, but who knows? All right, just going to kind of gently stay in the grass here. Again, we're a big old tail dragger plane with big puffy tires. We'll be perfectly fine. Just kind of kick my way. So for the purposes of our run-up, it's relatively easy to do. One thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and basically run it up to 1750 RPM. We're going to go ahead and bop between the two magnetos to make sure everything works. And we're just going to, I always like to exercise the prop handle just a little tiny bit there just to make sure everything's fine in that regard as well. One thing you could do too is, of course, you could click the ignition off and see if the engine stops. It's a great thing to test before you get going, but like I said, nothing too crazy. Now, one of the cool things with this particular aircraft is during taxi, one of the things they recommend you doing is you can actually set your flaps to the cruise position. So I've actually put down one click of flaps right now. I'm now in the cruise position as I'm kind of taxiing around. That seems a little weird, but because of the way the flaps are oriented, it gives you the ability to basically, especially if I move my tire, you can see how much of that wing moves when I hit my aileron. It gives you just a little bit better response, and you're less likely to kind of eat grass if I flip. Speaking of eating grass, let's go ahead and push ourselves into the wind here. I really wish that I had the ability to hit the right brake, because if I did, I could go and go ahead and stop. All right, looks pretty good. Just trying to orient ourselves into the wind the best I can here. That looks pretty good there. All right, parking brake set. Cool. So now we're going to do a run-up. Like I said, very easy run-up on this particular aircraft. Let's make sure everything's good. Looks good, looks good, looks good. That's all fine. I'm not worried about it too much. A little cold on the cylinder temp, but at least it's not hot, which would be not good. So we're going to go ahead and give it some gas, and we're going to go right up to 1,750 RPM. Make sure all these handles are set forward, which they are. Takes a pretty good kick here to get this thing going. That's 1,600, 1,700. Come on. That's about as close. And again, you don't have to be perfect here. It's not very nice to do these two planes anyway. We're going to come over to the magneto switch. I'll go ahead and hide this so you all can see it. Click it off. That should lose a little bit of RPM. It's about 100 RPM, not bad. Let's click it back to both. Come back. Actually, it was about 50 RPM. These are really fresh plugs. I'm amazed. Shut it off for a second. Good. The engine shuts down, which is what we wanted to do. We're going to go ahead and try the carburetor heat too, just to make sure this is working correctly. We should see a drop in RPM when we engage the carburetor heat. Yep. Oh my gosh, big drop, which makes sense because the air is nice and warm. Go ahead and bring the carburetor heat back on. Let's go ahead and exercise the propeller. Cool thing is when you do this, you should see an oil pressure shot. Yeah, that's actually correct. That's exactly what would happen, is your oil pressure would suddenly shift on you. That's exactly what it should do. Go ahead and pull the throttle all the way back, see if the engine goes ahead and dies on us. Wow, 500 RPM. Jeez. Go ahead and give it a tap. And now we're ready for takeoff. So again, pretty easy to get this thing in the air. All of our checks are all set. The engine's a good RPM. We haven't done anything weird. So one thing we want to do is before takeoff, the first thing that says on the checklist is we want to double check to make sure this down here is less than 230C, which are right about 200C, which does not surprise me, seeing as we've been making all sorts of noise over here, being pretty irritating. All right, let's give it enough gas to get rolling. There we go. Nice. We'll swing around this way. We're going to go ahead and line ourselves up with the runway, like I said, keeping it relatively straightforward here. We're going to line up. We're going to go ahead and set, let's see here, cylinder temperature is good, friction's good, line up in the runway, smooth operation, max takeoff power, anticipate, swing to the left. Ooh, I like that little piece of information there. The aircraft is going to fly itself at the runway at 55 to 65, which makes about sense. And of course, we want to reduce power once we get to that climb position. Before we get going, of course, we'll pop down to the takeoff flaps, which will give us a little bit more. And of course, this particular version of this aircraft, are we in MPH or are we in knots? We are in MPH. So we'll see just how close that actually is going to work here. Go ahead and line ourselves up at the runway. One thing I like to do, again, this is because it's a modern version of this plane, is we're going to leave that fuel boost pump on. In the event the engine-driven pump dies at any point during takeoff, we're not going to stress about it. Of course, we could sit there in the wobble pump and keep cranking it, but good luck with that. That's going to be a bit of a project. All right, we're lined up. Let's make sure everything is looking good here. So we got our flaps set. Our engine temperatures are looking like they're where they're supposed to be. It looks good, looks good, looks good. We've got our RPM set. We've got our fuel boost. Everything's set. Looks good. Go ahead and flip on the landing line because, why not? We'll let everybody know who's around us that, hey, we're about to take off kind of a thing. Fuel tank selection is beautiful. So now the book says you're supposed to take off without exceeding any engine limitations. So if you take a look real closely here, our engine limitation is basically this red line. And you can see we got a green zone here we can operate in. We got a green zone here. So we just can't go past 36.5. And obviously we can't overheat the engine. So let's go ahead and smoothly apply power. Remember, we're a tail dragger, so we want to do this very gently. Remember, the aircraft wants to pull to the left when you do this. And that's it right there. Nice. Wow, this thing's got some pickup. Now, my throttle is actually not all the way forward. Whee! I was really hoping I would get pulled to the left hard there, but that thing actually stayed pretty quick. It twisted to the right, which I respect that to death. So as always, whenever you're flying a high-performance aircraft like this, we always want to give ourselves, the moment you touch something is when something will break. So always keep that in mind, that before you start touching things, have yourself an escape plan ready to rock here. I'm looking at this field over here on my left. Feeling pretty good about that. We'll go ahead and pop my flaps up. We can put the flaps up to the climb position, or we could put them all the way up if we wanted to, but for now, I'm just going to put it to climb cruise, and now I'm going to go ahead and make my power reduction. So the power reduction is based on the weight of the aircraft. So in this particular case, you can see we're climbing pretty well right here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm a pretty heavy, actually I'm a light plane, so we're going to go down to 30 inches. Looks pretty good right there, getting bounced around that wind, nice. And then we're going to go ahead and reduce our RPM so that it comes down to 2,000 revolutions per minute. And that is it. That's climb power. Nice and easy. One of the things they did to make your life real simple is if you look at those two instruments there, you'll notice the one on the left clearly indicates what the best power setting is. So we can stay in the green, or we can be even better and pop it right to like the top of the blue, which you can see on both sides right there. So now we're pretty much good to go. We can begin our climb and start kind of cruising along. Initial climb is usually 65 miles an hour. The best way to do it is about 80 miles an hour. It's going to get you your best kind of cruise climb here. So I'm just going to go ahead and tap up a couple whacks of trim here, and we're just going to pull the nose up until we get to about 80. That looks pretty good. Believe it or not, this thing can go up pretty steeply. There we go. It's about 80 miles per hour. Getting bounced around by those nasty mountains up above us. And that gets us a pretty darn good climb rate. We're getting about, 500-600 feet per minute, which is pretty good, seeing as you can already see my current altitude is, 2,000 coming up on 3,000 feet, because, again, we're up here in the South Andes, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my turn and start making my way in the general direction of our objective here. Now, keep in mind, if you're navigating conventionally, which is the right way to do this plane, not my goofiness here, you would, of course, be worried about taking your speeds and your times and keeping everything perfectly balanced and all that other stuff under the sun. I'm not going to worry about that. I have a GPS over there, and it's going to kind of keep it on. In the real world, of course, I also use a little tablet with like your ForeFlight or your iFly GPS and stuff like that. Those are great, great, great tools, and they do mesh real nice with whatever you're operating here. Put a couple whacks of trim, and now we are on the way. Now we're going to let the nose come down just a tiny bit. Always watch your E's, T's, and P's here. Make sure everything looks okay. I'm taking a look right now. I can see my engine temperature is okay. Oil temperature is fine. That's good. Carb temperature is a little cold, but we're open throttle. Look how much fuel we've used already. Isn't that amazing? And we can see our engine temperatures in the dead center. For some reason, the designers of this aircraft did not give us cowl flaps that we could select. Why they did that blows my mind just a tiny bit, but I didn't design the plane. I'm just the only one flying it. So one of the things the book talks about during cruise is we always want to go switch to the rear tank first because we want to suck up the fuel and shift our center of gravity forward as our flight goes. Now that we've already got some altitude underneath us, any sort of switch of that particular fuel tank, make sure you pop on the fuel boost pump to kind of kill it a little bit. So we're going to head up to about 4,000 feet, which is not too bad for an aircraft like this. Again, these are really, really, really heavy-duty bush planes, and I've got it very, very lightly loaded. Looks about 4,000 feet there. I'm getting bounced all over the sky today. Whew. I don't think I was flying with real world weather, but now I'm beginning to suspect that I did. Oh well, what are you going to do? There we go. It's about 4,000 feet. Now we're ready to go ahead and get set up for cruise and climb and all that other good stuff. So climbing and cruising is relatively straightforward with this aircraft. The first thing is you have to remember, in Flight Sim, they thought that people needed to look down all the time, so your default viewpoint is like this. So when you're trying to set up for a cruise, you're not actually looking straight out the window. Like if I reset my view, the center line of where I'm looking is up here. So like when I'm actually trying to find that beautiful spot on the horizon to go ahead and start trimming the aircraft off, you can barely get to it because, wow, I am getting whacked here. Whew, that is a lot of, wow. Okay. One thing we do not have, of course, is an automatic pilot on this aircraft. We're completely on our own in that regard. Woof. Trying to get this thing all sorted out. So now that we've got ourselves up, we can go ahead and get our cruise power. Generally, when it comes to cruise power with this thing, we can use anything that is considered within the green arc, which I think is kind of neat. They do give you some items inside of the book as far as, general recommendations, but most of the recommendations they actually give you in the book for different kinds of settings are going to be geared towards, almost, I don't want to call it generalities, but there's, oh my gosh, I must have the most amount of lift. They just patched things, so I think they might have gotten a little silly when they patched things. Basically, the book says don't exceed these particular speeds when you're cruising around, kind of a thing like that. Like, don't go past this, don't put your flaps past this, more so than you need to do this at this particular power. But as a general rule, like I said, as long as we're in the green arc, everything's perfectly fine here. So our max continuous. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reduce power just a tiny bit here. Oof. I'm just getting whacked. That looks actually pretty good. We'll come down to 26. And we'll leave 2,000 RPM. That's going to get us going pretty well here. All right. Let's go ahead and give it a couple more whacks of trim. Go ahead and pop out those cruise flaps real quickly. That's going to cause a slight shift of the point of view of us in this particular case, because now what's going to happen is that extra little bit of lift we're getting is going to be traded to help give us a slightly higher speed. So take a look over at the arc there. I'm doing about 135. That's pretty good. Again, that's not too bad for something that's this big. I would not consider this to be an aerodynamic plane in the slightest. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and skip trip here. All right, looks pretty good. We got that runway right off our nose. So landing this aircraft is interesting because, like I said, the POH that I dug up for it is not to say that it's non-specific. It's just to say that it's very pilot's choice is what I want to call it. But anyway, general rule here is we have an aircraft that's fairly heavy. And we also have to kind of keep in mind that when you dip those flaps down all the way, it's a tremendous amount of drag. When you put those two things together, you create an aircraft that is a very short landing distance, but at the same time as you have this new complication where you could easily do some real damage to the plane as you're approaching. So I'm going ahead and using my descent technique here. One thing you want to keep in mind during descent is not to shock cool the engine. I'm looking down at my cylinder head temperature there, and I'm whopping 210 degrees right now. So there's no danger right now. I can actually pull that throttle back just a tiny bit more. As we approach, of course, we want to go ahead and do our classic little gumps checks here. So we're going to make sure our gas is on our fullest tank. Our fullest tank, if you look at our little gauges real quick, we're definitely looking at the front tank as our fullest tank here. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that on. Of course, don't shut the engine off like I just did. That's pretty embarrassing. Landing light is on. I've got that already. Once we get under 120, we can go ahead and get that first click a notch in there. We're going to slow down considerably. I'm going to go ahead and put my propeller handle all the way up. Gaps, undercarriage, mixture, propeller flaps, light speed. All right, looking pretty good. Swing around. We're going to start popping in those takeoff flaps. It's going to give you a nose to pitch change. Now, the POH with this aircraft warns you the fact that when you're coming in for a landing, you're going to have a very significant nose down attitude. So if I actually stick my head up so I'm level with the horizon, notice I have to come down like this to be able to actually see my instruments here. But now, at least by adjusting my head, I have a better idea of that relativity to the horizon. So right now, I'm actually pointing downwards with the aircraft. If I have to pull up in order to level, this is actually level. So it's just important that you kind of understand that, because as you come in, you don't want to go ker-smack. Now, the book describes the ability to go ahead and basically do a 3-point landing on this thing. If you're going to do a 3-point landing, it actually is a 1-point landing that transitions to a 3-point landing, which I find very, very interesting. A lot of people think of, oh, we're going to come in and do kind of a 2-pointer kind of a thing like that. You could do a 2-pointer. Now, one of the things the book warns against is if we have no flaps down, the nose attitude is going to be very, very high when we actually go to stick the thing down on the ground. As far as approach speeds goes, incredibly, the book says you can go as slow as 68 miles per hour depending on weight-full flaps. Now, I'm looking down at the airspeed indicator there, and 68 does not look very good. As a matter of fact, if I do 60 miles per hour, I'll have to quickly do the math for us. 60 miles per hour multiplied by 1.3, we should be approaching at 73 miles an hour. So it's actually very interesting that if you have the confidence, and I love the way the book describes it, you could theoretically land this thing basically at a stall, which I find interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and feed in some more flaps here. I'm going to go ahead and double check all my switches. Now, this position right here is landing flaps. If we wanted to go one flap click past this, you can already see just how far down those darn flaps are. That would give us the ability to do that ultra short landing. Another thing that the POH describes is we really should not be doing landings in crosswinds greater than 10 miles an hour, which I find kind of interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and smoothly reduce power here. We're pretty much a little high on glide slope here, which is fine. Lift that nose up. Again, we should bleed off a little bit of speed. And about 80 miles an hour should be about the FAA's recommended speed for an approach here. Like I said, we can certainly come in slower, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. Go ahead and pop that last click of flaps in. We actually have a flap and a half setting there. So go ahead and pop to full flaps. And you can actually see there's about 3 or 4 clicks to get to that full flap setting. So now our flaps are all the way down. You can see just how much drag those things create. We're going about 70 miles an hour, which is a bit slow. When we reduce the throttle, this plane is going to stop flying. So that's one of the things we have to watch out for. Remember, we're nose down right now. We need to make sure we land pretty much on the tail wheel. Get over the runway, and I'm going to go around. It. Smoothly apply full power. We're going to make sure we don't exceed any of our maximums. All right, gently reduce our flaps. So we need to keep ourselves out of the not white zone when our flaps are. And we're good to go. So now you're probably saying, wait a minute, I thought you were landing this plane. Why on earth did you just go around? As you probably noticed during the approach, there was that really, really strong crosswind component. And one of the things I know about planes like this is because that little tail wheel in the back, when we get really, really close to the ground, it's not like a tricycle plane where we can kind of stick it. We actually had a really, really good probability of basically looping the plane, which could have ended really, really bad for us. So instead what I'm going to do is, because the wind just does not support it at this particular airfield, I'm going to go ahead and land on that field right next to the airport itself. All right, go reduce power. Hey, how you doing? Nice headphones. I wish I had headphones that nice. We're just kind of, like I said, kind of line this up at that little field right there. There's nothing wrong with this. And we'll go ahead and use that short field technique, but at least the wind will be facing us properly this time. All right. Go ahead and bring those flaps in. I'll do our gumps checks one more time, make sure everything's okay. And there we go. Get that full flaps. You can see just how powerful and strong that crosswind is, which is exactly what we expected. We're back to our 80 miles an hour, which is a sweet speed. We got it right there. Looks pretty good. Again, we're just going to pop right in that field right there. In the real world, of course, you can't really request the field. At my local airport, you actually can request the field, which is something I always thought was kind of funny. All right, we're going to go ahead and come in at minimum speed. As I say, about 68 miles an hour is a pretty good speed. We're now dead into the wind here. We're doing about 60, 70 now. You can see that airspeed needle is dancing. Remember, our nose to attitude is down. If we're going to be landing like this, we basically want to land tail wheel first. There it is. Pull that control all the way back towards you. And what you're going to do is you're going to get a little bit of the bounce. Again, don't touch the brake until the bounce is gone. Gently apply the brakes. And delightful. Now, something you probably observed, though, when we did touch down there is how the plane kind of went boing, 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 like that kind of a thing. It's going to do that if you don't have a lot of weight in the back compartment. Remember, because of the way we shifted. Now, imagine that boingy, boingy with that 15-mile-an-hour crosswind that we were about to land in. So again, just because the plane can does not mean you necessarily should, and it's worthwhile to kind of take a look at those different components. Shutdown on this aircraft is super simple. When you want to come to a complete stop, don't stand to the brakes. You're going to do a face plant, which is always pretty embarrassing. Pretty much the same as in aircraft. Our radio is going to come off. We're going to go ahead and pull out the mixture control until the engine stops, and so does us. Enjoy.